Hi everyone, my name is Irene Sandoval, and today I'll be presenting Chapter 18, Psychobiology. I chose this chapter because I found this one to be the most interesting to me. Psychobiology is the study of how biology, behavior, and mental function is all related together. In this chapter, they do this by explaining psychological phenomena in biological terms. Hippocrates is the father of medicine. He is a Greek scientist that taught and studied medicine. He was alive in 460 to 377 BC. He came up with the humoral theory of health, which means illness occurs when all four of bodily fluids and humors is out of balance. He also came up with the Hippocratic oath of integrity, compassion, and confidentiality, which he believed that everybody should live by and uphold. He also came up with some treatments, and one of them being of how to relieve pressure from broken bones, fasting, and what the benefits of eating honey and vinegar would be. He also believed that physicians should review and analyze everything that they have created before they started creating another thesis or analyzing something new. Another person who was very important in this chapter was Carl Lashley. He was a modern pioneer of psychobiology. He was born in June 7, 1890, and he died in August 7, 1958. He is the 61st most cited psychologist in the 20th century, and he studied how the brain learned and how it memorized things. He also came up with the principle of equal potentiality, which means that if one part of the brain is damaged, then the other part can basically just compensate of what that part of the brain was supposed to do. Meaning that if it would be damaged, then another part can learn how to do what that part of the brain did and basically just take over it. He supported Watson's behaviorism, but he wasn't able to find neurophysiological to support anything of what he was saying. He then later found out memory is complex and it is a lot harder than it was at first thought out to be. He found out that it was more like of a puzzle pieces being put together throughout the whole cortex rather than just being one simple thing. He then found out that if one part of the brain is destroyed, and it would be memory at a young age, you would be able to build it up. If you're older, it is harder to fix it. Also, it has to be with the amount of tissue that was destroyed rather than just the location of the brain of the part that was damaged. He called this mass action because he believed that it was more of how much was damaged rather than the location of it. Because if you're an adult, then you would really not be able to fix it or come back to your full potential of that you had for memory, or reach that full potential as you get older. Rather, if you were little and damaged it, then you'll be able to get back up there with time, depending on how much was damaged. Lashley concluded that the brain's functioning were more similar to the Gestalt theory because people organize things as a whole rather than seeing it individually, which is what they were doing with memory before. They were just seeing it as something big rather than seeing how it all went into its little groups. Like, for example, the pencil. You just see a pencil as a pencil, but you don't look into it more deeply and break it up into its parts. Like if when you're writing with it, you're using the lead. When you're erasing, you're using the eraser, which is something he covered because he said that if you broke things up into things, you'll see how the Gestalt theory made more sense and connected with memory. Donald Hebb was also influenced by Lashley. He sought out how neurons work together in neuropsychology in the process of learning and how they all came together. He saw how the neurons in the brain that were near each other activate and create a cell assembly. For example, when a baby hears that the mom is coming, he puts together the mom's voice coming and his footsteps, and then remembers the feelings that he felt and other neurons that were activated when mom hugged him or fed him, or just like the feeling that they got when mom came near them. So all those cells come together and create a cell assembly, which triggers memory, learning, all of them together. Another example of this might be when you smell some type of food, you'll remember how you used that food in the past before, what recipe you made, so it can trigger you to remember the recipe if you had forgotten it. Another thing might be like perfume. If you remember smelling perfume, your neurons for smell get triggered, and then you remember what your environment was like when you smelled that smell before, or a certain type of memory you had connected to that smell when you had smelled it before. Another person who was influenced by Lashley was Roger Sperry. He came up with the split brain theory. He first started with animals, and it was by cutting their corpus and callosums and optic ch18. Sorry, I might not be saying that right. And by cutting these exactly in that way, it would make it so they could learn independently and not have too much abnormality after doing so, and they're still able to stay alive and function. Since he saw that this worked with animals, he then started using it for people who suffer from severe epilepsy, which epilepsy is people who suffer from seizures and they were not able to help them or give them the correct medication, or didn't know that they could use medication for that. Yeah. Their condition got better significantly and it almost completely stopped. It also didn't cause them to have much severe damage to themselves, like their personality or their everyday things. That's not that all of them didn't happen, so it wasn't a good fix for everybody, but for some it did help them. By doing so, they actually found out that they're able to study the function of the left brain and the right brain. And this wasn't able to be done by its own, and they found out that each side of the brain has its own way of learning, memory, having emotions, and their consciousness. This is when the left brain and right brain studies started. At that point, they thought people were starting to use that they were either left brain dominant or right brain dominant, but they started to find out that that was not right, because no one has only half brain of smartness, or the other half of the brain of smartness, or have two brains. It came out to be that they had all that one brain all together, which was uniquely put together especially for that person. So it was basically canceled out that you're either smarter because your right brain of your right side of your brain is smarter, because that's not how it was. Then came euthology, which is a science of animal behavior, usually found in the study of zoology, but it's very frequently used in psychology. It dates back before even Darwin would start using animals for his studies. Bertrand Russell ran some tests, and he used these tests on chickens, and he wanted to see what were instinctive behaviors that the chickens already had prior to being taught anything, or how they even were able to absorb that, being taught those things. And this is how he started on the specific species behavior training, and to see what advantages and disadvantages animals had, and why sometimes it was a lot harder for some of them to learn it rather than others. For example, birds had wings initially just to protect them from the cold, but then later on, when they were being taught to fly, they were able to pick it up much faster than a tiger would be, because instinctively they're already like wired to know how to fly, or it makes it easier to learn how to fly. Lastly, behavioral genetics came into psychobiology. This study believed that personality characteristics were also linked to your genetics, not just the way that you got brought up. This connected to nature versus nurture. This study that they did was being used with 4 separate set of twins. One pair was fraternal, but they were separated. And then the second pair was fraternal twins, but they were raised together. The third pair was identical twins raised together, and then the fourth pair was identical twins raised apart. They discovered that your intelligence is 70% of your genetics, rather than just being the way you got brought up, even though it is a big portion, or it is a big part of how you were raised and what you were taught, but it always goes back to at least 70% of it being your genetics. They also wanted to know how personality traits were genetically disposed, or what your environment was like. And they found out that biological children who were raised by their biological parent, even if they had a lot of similarities, but even if they weren't raised together, or they never met them before, and then later met them later on in life, they still had a lot more similarities than adopted parents that were raised by their adopted children. Their adopted children wouldn't have as much as same personality traits as biological parents with biological children. This also had to go with the same thing with siblings. If you have siblings that you're biologically related to, you have more common traits with them, rather than if you were raised together, but one of you guys were adopted, or you guys were both adopted. Okay, thank you guys.